Paper Mill Playhouse acknowledges that our theater stands on the traditional land of the Lenni Lenape. We honor the land and the indigenous people who inhabited it for thousands of years before European settlers arrived.
Welcome to Paper Mill Prologues. I'm Lorna Jordan, Manager of Outreach Programs here at Paper Mill Playhouse, and I'm so excited to welcome you to the fifth and final show of our 84th season, Jonathan Larson's generation-defining rock opera, Rent. The goal of Prologues is to give our audience an extra layer of insight and context for our productions by exploring some of the themes, histories, and creative voices behind each show. Today, we'll be exploring the relationship between musicals and opera, the cultural influence of Larson's work, and just what it means to live La Vie Bohème. Simply put, a bohemian is a person, often a writer or artist, eschewing the conventional lifestyle, living in poverty and subsisting on the ideals of art and beauty. American writer Gillette Burgess gives this description: to take the world as one finds it, the bad with the good, making the best of the present moment, to laugh at fortune alike, whether she be generous or unkind, to spend freely when one has money, and hope gaily when one has none, to fleet the time carelessly, living for love and art. This is the temper and spirit of the modern bohemian in his outward and visible aspect. The term bohemian was originally associated with the roving Romany people, believed to have come to France from Bohemia. The Romani were considered outsiders, and the romanticized term of bohemian embraced the idea of living outside of the accepted societal norms, effectively distancing oneself from the bourgeoisie. What we now know as bohemianism began in Paris in the 1850s. Within this community of impoverished artists and writers was the author Henri Murger, whose collection of short stories titled Scènes de la vie de Bohème brought a legitimacy and reverence to the lifestyle. Murger's work consisted of loosely related stories featuring characters based on people he knew, actual individuals from the Latin Quarter of Paris, which made the stories very popular among the locals. These stories were originally published individually in the literary magazine Le Corsaire, but Murger eventually teamed up with playwright Théodore Barrière, and they co-authored a play based on his stories titled La vie de la Bohème, which was staged at the Théâtre des Variétés to great success. With the popularity of the play, Murger was able to publish his stories as a novel, and he added additional material to tie the stories together more completely. Since the onset of bohemianism, audiences have reveled in watching the pursuit of freedom, beauty, art, and love, despite the woes of poverty and the ills of society. One of the most well-known adaptations of Murger's work is, of course, Italian composer Giacomo Puccini's operatic masterpiece, La Bohème, which premiered in 1896. The Metropolitan Opera has described the piece as the definitive depiction of joys and sorrows, of love and loss. On closer inspection, it explores the deep emotional significance hidden in the trivial things, a bonnet, an old overcoat, a chance meeting with a neighbor, that make up our everyday lives. Puccini's La Bohème is a celebration of the bohemian lifestyle as it exalts the ordinary through extraordinary artistry. Murger's work would go on to influence countless literary, theatrical, and musical artists, and that influence is still felt today. In 1897, Ruggero Leoncavallo's lesser-known opera, also titled La Bohème, premiered. In 1904, the zarzuela, titled Bohemios by Amadeo Vives, premiered. With the advent of moving pictures, more opportunities for adaptations emerged. In 1916, Alice Brady starred in the silent film La Bohème, directed by Albert Capellani. 10 years later, silent film star Lillian Gish headlined MGM's version of La Bohème. In 1935, Gertrude Lawrence would star in an adaptation titled Mimi.
How can you forget your promises? How can I believe that you really love me if you break your word the very first day?
And another 10 years later, Marcel L'Herbier would direct the French film La Vie de Bohème. In 1965, Franco Zeffirelli directed a film version of Puccini's opera. But the inspiration didn't stop at opera and film. Murger's work even went on to inspire a jazz album by pianist Dave Burrell in 1969 and a play for radio known as The Bohemians, written by David Nathan in 1983. In 1992, Murger's work was back on screen in La Vie Bohème, a film directed by Auki Kaurismäki. And in 2001, Baz Luhrmann's film, Moulin Rouge, brought the story to life with contemporary popular music and would be eventually adapted into a pop musical. But before Luhrmann's pop interpretation, there came the rock opera of Rent, Jonathan Larson's groundbreaking work that would combine the gritty idealism of bohemian culture, the intensity of operatic art, and the defiance of rock. While living in Greenwich Village, Larson was inspired by his own bohemian community. The characters he created were inspired by real-life relationships, places, and events mirroring his experience as a struggling artist. While Rent parallels Murger's stories, one major difference between his and Murger's work was the inclusion of characters of LGBTQ+ identities. Earlier theatrical works had featured LGBTQ+ characters, among them La Cage aux Folles, Falsettos, and Angels in America, and these helped pave the way for Rent. Larson's characters were not typical for a Broadway stage, and part of what made Rent so iconic was that the characters' stories weren't predetermined by their identities. Rather than commenting on the racial or sexual identity of the character, Larson simply allowed his characters to live. While their identities help fuel the story, they do not define it.
Viva la Vie Bohème!
While Rent was groundbreaking, it wasn't the first of its kind. Aside from its loosely based source material, Rent's other major influence came from a phenomenon that began in the late 1960s, the birth of the rock musical and rock operas. Seen as arguably one of the greatest decades of change in American history, society was at a crossroads with different generations butting heads on various current events. In the United States, the increase in protests and social movements, including the rise of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, and the sexual revolution, were spearheaded by those of the counterculture and in marginalized communities. In the world of theater, however, Broadway was at its own crossroads. With homogeneous audiences comprised of middle to upper class people, Broadway stages during that time featured widely successful commercial hits such as Hello Dolly, Fiddler on the Roof, Mame, Camelot, and other classic shows. But while churning out hit shows, Broadway's cultural influence was quickly diminishing with young audiences, and the rise of rock and roll music was dominating the charts. As the younger generation was becoming more socially aware and engaging in activism and politics, they increasingly saw Broadway as old-fashioned and out of touch with what was happening in the world. It wasn't until 1968, when an unlikely show premiered on Broadway, that the voice of youthful rebellion found its place in musical theater.
When the moon is in the seventh house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planet and love will still start. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, the age of Aquarius.
Hair started in 1967 at the Public Theater with book and lyrics by James Rado and Jerome Ragney and music by Galt McDermott. The show's provocative subject matter, with its embrace and encapsulation of hippie culture, utilized a musical score of rock music. Its depiction of illegal drug use, the liberation of one's body and sexuality, as well as its protest of the Vietnam War and the draft, caused a radical shift in what was deemed acceptable for the stage. What made this show one of a kind was its dedication to authenticity and the voices it chose to amplify, and it was a direct reflection of the real lives that were being affected outside of the theater doors. In fact, a number of the original cast members were recruited from off the street to be in the production, some of whom had never stepped foot on a theater stage before. The evolution of the rock musical would find itself an alternative in the form of the rock opera. What sets rock operas apart from rock musicals is that rock opera takes its basis from traditional operas, where the entire story is sung through. The major difference, however, is its substitution of rock music for classical music as the soundscape. In their inception, rock operas were released as concept albums by rock bands. Two early examples were SF Sorrow by Pretty Things and The Who's Tommy. The release of these concept albums would lead to the creation of arguably the most popular rock opera, Jesus Christ Superstar, in 1970. Created by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, this concept album, loosely based on the Passion of Christ, blended orchestral sounds with rock music. Jesus Christ Superstar became an international sensation that year, selling over 3 million copies worldwide, and in turn would be adapted for the stage, premiering on Broadway in 1971. Jesus Christ Superstar had its share of controversy amongst the public, but the show was a smash hit amongst the younger generation for its rock-infused, socio-political take on the Passion play. However, religious groups and institutions criticized its depiction and critique of the story of Jesus Christ, as well as its choices in casting, which featured African-American actor Ben Vereen as Judas Iscariot and half-Japanese singer and actress Yvonne Elliman as Mary Magdalene. These controversies only made the rock opera even more of a phenomenon amongst the general public, and Jesus Christ Superstar would be nominated for 5 Tony Awards that season, as well as being adapted into a feature film in 1973. Many rock operas continued to be made in the form of concept albums, with later examples including Pink Floyd's The Wall, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust by David Bowie, as well as American Idiot by Green Day. Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice would continue their success with rock opera concept albums turned into stage musicals with Evita in the late 1970s. Despite the success of these albums and musicals, by the 1980s, Broadway ultimately abandoned the rock musical in favor of its contemporary, the pop mega musical.
The Phantom of the Opera is there.
Since the Broadway premiere of Hair in 1968, it would be nearly 30 years until Broadway would see another show that would directly speak to and capture the sound of its current young generation. Taking inspiration from these influential shows that captured the here and now of modern counterculture ideals, as well as adopting experimental storytelling that was not, at the time, popular in mainstream theater, Jonathan Larson and the creative team of Rent were able to, as Larson once said, bring musical theater to the MTV generation and create a Hair for the 90s. Just as Hair grappled with difficult issues of its time, so too did Rent, by including such topics as addiction, housing inequality, and the AIDS crisis. In 1981, the first cases of AIDS were identified in the United States. At the time, it hit the LGBTQ+ communities in Los Angeles and New York hard, and it was highly stigmatized and understudied. Fueled by this injustice, activists saw the need for change, both in how the public viewed AIDS and in how it was treated in a medical setting.
Kramer delivered a fiery speech, and I remember he asked like half of the audience to stand up, and he said, "You're all going to be dead in 6 months. Now what are we going to do about it?"
AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. We are a diverse, nonpartisan group of individuals united in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis.
At a rally at the Health and Human Services building in Washington, D.C., Vito Russell described what it was like living with AIDS in his speech, Why We Fight.
Living with AIDS in this country is like living in the Twilight Zone. Living with AIDS is like living through a war which is happening only for those people who happen to be in the trenches. Every time a shell explodes, you look around and you discover that you've lost more of your friends. But nobody else notices. It isn't happening to them. They're walking the streets as though we weren't living through some sort of nightmare. And only you can hear the screams of the people who are dying and their cries for help. No one else seems to be noticing.
The morning after that speech, united with activists from around the country, ACT UP shut down the Food and Drug Administration headquarters. They were protesting FDA policies, including the use of placebos in experiments and policies that made it difficult for people with AIDS to get experimental medications. After the protest, the FDA began collaborating with activists. In the year following, Dr. Anthony Fauci announced federal implementation of ACT UP's idea, now called the parallel track, that changed the way patients can access experimental medications. While ACT UP was not immune to internal struggles of racism and other social issues, it was a community of people that stood together to demand something more. Along with other activists and organizations, ACT UP organized protests, affinity groups such as Science Club to study and follow AIDS research, and fostered community to support people with AIDS. The theater community created organizations such as Broadway Cares, Equity Fights AIDS, which since 1988 has raised more than $300 million for essential services for people living with HIV/AIDS, struggling with COVID-19, and facing other critical illnesses. Throughout the crisis, organizations and artists continued to reframe the narrative, focusing their efforts on support and survival. Larson's Rent was no exception. His characters toast one another at the end of Act 1, proclaiming to people living with, not dying from disease. We see this expression of hope and community throughout the show, with other iconic moments like life support, seasons of love, and no day but today. In these dangerous times, where it seems the world is ripping apart at the seams, we can all learn how to survive from those who stare death squarely in the face every day, and we should reach out to each other and bond as a community. Jonathan Larson wrote these words shortly before his passing in 1996 due to an undetected heart condition. Sadly, he never got to see the success of Rent, which received universal acclaim, including the Pulitzer Prize in Drama for a distinguished play by an American author, and 4 Tony Awards. Rent and Jonathan Larson's legacy continue to inspire us all to embrace the bohemian ideal and to live like there is no day but today. For everyone here at Paper Mill, we thank you for being a part of our community this season, and we look forward to welcoming you back for our 85th. Enjoy the show.